Anya Wright is, as Hannah mentioned, Youth Representative on the Maine Climate Council, is a senior at the College of the Atlantic, was recently at the COP in Madrid, the most recent COP, and has the floor to give us some thoughts about how she's viewing these challenges in what's in front of us. So, Anya, you have the floor. Roaming or fixed?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for that introduction. So my name's Anya Wright. I'm the Youth Representative to the Climate Council, representing all your children and future generations. No pressure. So yeah, I've been asked to speak today about my recent trip to Madrid, where I attended the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, 25th Conference of the Parties, which to save my breath, I'll call COP25 from here on out. And so this gathering of governments happens every year. It's been happening longer than I've been alive. I'm 22, and this was the 25th COP. And it brings around 30,000 people together from all over the world for UN negotiations on our climate and our future. And this meeting was both super uplifting and also deeply troubling, so I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share my experience with you all today. So this was my second COP conference. I went to Poland last year with my school, College of the Atlantic, sends a delegation of students every year. And quite honestly, it felt like a repeat of last year's negotiations. You may have seen headlines at the end of the COP that denounced it as a failure, even that it was the worst outcome of any COP. And sadly, I wholeheartedly agree. Nation states argued over the same sticking points, leading to more inaction and no ambition. And unfortunately, this is a common theme of these international negotiations, where rich developed countries consistently slow down negotiations in order to avoid their responsibility to lead in addressing the climate crisis. It was really disappointing sitting in on negotiations on Article 6, and Article 6, not to get too into policy wonky stuff, but it's an article of the Paris Agreement that determines if and when countries will be able to create carbon markets. And hearing nations block resolution after resolution, pushing for solutions that would help their economies but would fail to address the climate crisis, and that would doom the lives of so many. And a big takeaway that I've had, and many others have had as well, is that these negotiations are not about protecting people. They're about protecting power and making money and keeping business as usual. And so international players are not doing enough. And this is why Maine must lead and why I'm so excited to be here today. Despite the US being one of the largest historical emitters and contributors to the climate crisis, we are slated to leave the Paris Agreement next year, meaning that we won't be participating in these conferences. In exiting from these negotiations, the US pathetically blocked resolutions left and right, refusing measures like finance for poor countries to adapt and mitigate climate change, or even blocking a resolution that would make it possible for countries to adopt more ambitious targets for emissions reductions. These same unresolved issues will now carry over into next year, with or without the US, leading to more time wasted and more lives put in danger. Meanwhile, US emissions continue to rise, with the current administration weakening environmental protections and bolstering the fossil fuel industry. The US is not doing enough, and this is also why Maine must lead, and also why it is so important that we as a state are in the US Climate Alliance, a bipartisan coalition of states that are committed to the Paris Agreement. So the beginning of 2020 brought us to the end of our third decade of climate inaction on the international level. The rules negotiated by nation states that are in place, like the Paris Agreement, are so weak that even if we meet its demands, we will not stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, which is a level that's been deemed to be extremely dangerous. Developed countries like the US have failed to reduce global emissions, encourage things like equity, or take action at the level that is so desperately needed by people around the world. Which is why it is so critical that the Maine Climate Council exists, and that we act locally but think globally. To get sciencey for a second, and I know there will be a lot of science today, so I'll keep it short, but every year, humans emit around 42 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. And based on science provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have about 420 gigatons of atmospheric space remaining before we reach levels of emissions that will cause those 1.5 degrees of warming. So when you do some quick math, that's about 10 years of business as usual before we reach atmospheric concentrations that would have serious impacts on our local lobster fishermen here in Maine, that would cause more frequent intense heat waves, more frequent tragic fires, loss of species, and collapse of ecosystems. And 10 years is not a lot of time. Historically, the US is the most responsible for the climate crisis. Because carbon dioxide stays in our atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years, and because we have burned fossil fuels in the US throughout our industrialization and growth into the largest economy in the world, we are responsible for more of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than any other country. We also have some of the highest per capita emissions currently. So when I say that we have 420 gigatons left, it's important to consider also who should be able to emit those gigatons. So as we move into this next decade, we need to determine not only how we as a globe can drastically reduce our emissions, but also how to do it equitably. And when I say equity, I mean fairness, and I know we've talked about that a bit already today. If we as a country are most responsible for the climate crisis, we need to support those who are least responsible for climate change and allow them to use those remaining 420 gigatons of emissions that we have left in the atmosphere to develop. This means that it's even more important to cut our emissions now as a country, and why we need to act boldly in Maine. And so here today, I feel that it's less important to report on the nitty-gritty policy and inaction that happened in these negotiations that I was at in December. I feel like it's more important to share stories of people that I met at the COP, which brings not only negotiators, but also civil society members from all over the world. One young man that I met, Karlan Zakaras, is a youth activist from the Marshall Islands, and he spoke about the 16-foot swells his country had experienced earlier this year, which forced 200 people from their island, which is just 2 meters above sea level. They've been asked by the COP to adapt and elevate, with migration as the only plan B, even though they are responsible for, and this number gets me every time, 0.00001% of emissions globally. So when we're working on our climate plan in Maine, I hope we think of Karlan and those least responsible for the climate crisis. Keisha Aran Maria from the Philippines spoke about the 45% of her population that is reliant on marine resources to survive and thrive. She spoke about the risks her country faces to sea level rise, ocean acidification, and saltwater intrusion, issues that we also talk about here in Maine. So when we're working on our climate plan for Maine, I hope we think of Keisha and all of those whose livelihoods are being lost to the climate crisis. A young man named Arshak from Russia spoke of his experience as a climate protester in Russia, how he is arrested almost every Friday as he strikes in solidarity with youth around the globe. He was recently jailed for 6 days for protesting. He talked about how he is not afraid to be arrested, but afraid instead to not be doing enough. Angela Valenzuela from Chile, which is where the COP was originally supposed to be held, but it was moved at the last moment due to political unrest, spoke of how the cameras of the world don't often look to the global south. In Chile, she and millions of others are protesting in the streets for a better quality of life, for equity, and the end of the extractivist industry that has profited off the country's natural resources. The same extractivist culture has privatized their water, killed those who protect it, and continues to attack the Chilean people on their streets. So when we're working on our climate plan in Maine, I hope we think of Asher and Angela and all the people who live in places where it is not safe to protest for what is absolutely necessary. Rose Whipple of the Asante Dakota and Ho-Chunk Nations in the United States spoke of her struggle to fight the Line 3 tar sands oil pipeline in the Midwest, a pipeline that was approved, threatening her people and their homeland, highlighting institutions that value corporate profit over indigenous lives and practices. She spoke of the links that the climate crisis has to racism, colonialism, white supremacy, and sexism. So when we're working on our climate plan for Maine, I hope we think of Rose and of Indigenous people around the globe who have been continuously fighting for their human rights and their ways of life, and who have lived in harmony with our world for thousands of years, whose practices we must respect and listen to. And finally, Hilda Flavia from Uganda spoke of how the climate crisis reminds her of the deep racism and apartheid experienced by her ancestors. She spoke of how the continent of Africa is deeply cut by the actions and words of people in power, and how she thought that this COP was the best time for developed countries to exercise their moral duty, but how they don't seem to care. You have dreams, she said, but we have dreams too. These dreams have turned into nightmares. Nightmares which are right now being negotiated by world leaders without our say, by the fossil fuel companies that are financing this COP. When we are working on our climate plan for Maine, I hope we think of Hilda and of all marginalized communities who have had their voices silenced. In a side event in the same building as the negotiations, I listened to a talk by women farmers from Tanzania, Kenya, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. One of the speakers at the end of her talk said that in the global north, you talk about lifestyle change, using less, changing technology, and adapting. In the global south, we talk about how to survive. So yes, it's certainly inconvenient that we will have to make bold changes in the state of Maine. And yes, we may not have the largest population or the largest climate impact. But we must act not only to protect our livelihoods here in this great state, but also to save the lives of millions across the globe who are already being affected by this crisis and who are least responsible. We must stand with Indigenous peoples, people in poverty, women, youth, and local communities whose lives are already being devastated by climate change and who are losing hope of justice from the international climate talks. And so when I came back home to Maine in December, I quite honestly felt empowered. We have so much to be hopeful here, and you all sitting in this room today are part of that hope. You've committed your time and your energy to this crisis. At the UN, I was not proud to be from the US, but I was proud to be from Maine. I was proud to be from a state that asks, Maine won't wait, will you? And to be a part of an initiative like the Climate Council, which has committed itself to solve this crisis within our state, setting a critical example for the US and countries around the world. We should keep this in mind as we move forward and make sure that we are doing as much as we can, whether it be by furthering our goals to reduce emissions, by working hard to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion within the Climate Council and its stakeholders and supporters, or ensuring that profits are not put above the people of Maine and the world. And to end on a note of hope, on the first Friday of the COP, there was a peaceful march of over 500,000 people in the streets of Madrid, led by Indigenous leaders from all over the globe. And I don't know if you've ever been in a crowd that big, and if you've had, I'm sure you'll resonate, but I had a feeling of absolute awe standing on a park bench, looking far in front of me and far behind me, and all I could see was people. 500,000 people marched that evening, almost half the population of Maine, demanding system change, not climate change, and pushing for climate action. This is a movement that is growing around the globe, with mass climate protests and youth strikes breaking records consistently. And that movement is here in Maine, too. As was mentioned, there are over 100 youth joining us for our meeting today, and many other Mainers from all walks of life that are joining us today to push for the same action here, to address the climate crisis swiftly and justly. Addressing this crisis will take everyone, and as I said before, it is so critical that you are all here today to share your knowledge, perspective, and expertise. Because change is absolutely inevitable, the science is crystal clear. But justice is not, and that's what I'm here, and that's what I hope you all are all here to ensure a safe, livable future for all in the state of Maine. And if my experience at COP25 has told me anything, it's that we must determine this future now for ourselves and not wait for international negotiations to save us. Thanks so much.
There we go.